NVIDIA has shown that it doesn't care that much. There's some 30 series stuff. Go buy that if you want it, you peasants. Otherwise, up here for the non-poors, we have the 40 series. When Intel Arc launched, I remember talking to one of the people I respect the most in this industry. He's highly technical, brilliant technical analyst, and it's David Cantor. And he's been interviewed on this channel before. But David said to me, Intel doesn't have to be number one. It just has to be second place. He said Intel won't take market share from NVIDIA. It's going to take it from AMD. And he was absolutely right. Intel Arc has been competing at the more budget end of cards since it launched. And that's exactly what Intel has to do because it's battling from a weaker position. NVIDIA has shown that it doesn't compete there. Many years ago, an NVIDIA employee told me when I asked about how do you intend to compete with these AMD price cuts of whatever card it was, he said, Steve, we don't compete on price, we compete on quality. And NVIDIA with the modern 40 series, its lowest card for price is a 4060 at $300. So Intel and AMD are the ones who are in the closest competition at this, we'll call it budget end of the market these days. This flexible use of the word there, mid-range. But AMD is the one that really has to fight hard. And interestingly, AMD has been fighting pretty hard against NVIDIA's $700, $800 class card. So things are changing a little bit where they're all starting to fall into their own place. And Intel is the one we're focusing on today because the launch of Arc was abysmal. It was the worst GPU launch that we have ever covered. And it was all because of the drivers. Our immediate concerns were that Intel would kill the project before it could fix the drivers, that corporate management would lose faith in it. Late last year, we revisited Arc for drivers, and we saw that they had improved a lot. And now we're revisiting performance, now that the market has adjusted and shipped the rest of the cards, at least for now, in the refreshes. So our early conclusions were that when it worked, the hardware was competitive, but it was the when it worked that was problematic because we couldn't recommend something that works sometimes really well and other times not at all. That has slowly been shifting. And now going on almost 2 years later, we feel a little more comfortable recommending Arc to a slightly wider group of users. This huge list of patch notes we're showing is just one of the two most recent drivers. Intel published similarly sized updates for over a year now. And that's dangerous for AMD and NVIDIA whenever they're competing in a similar price class to Intel's Arc cards, because AMD and NVIDIA's drivers are so impressively mature and established already that there's little extra juice to squeeze out of driver updates. And that's where we think AMD is almost more threatened right now at this range of the market than NVIDIA is. NVIDIA has shown that it doesn't care that much. There's some 30 series stuff. Go buy that if you want it, you peasants. Otherwise, up here for the non-poors, we have the 40 series. And that leaves AMD, which oddly, again, has been fighting harder at the 7900 XT mark than down here. So let's look into it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and the CryoSheet graphene pads. These CryoSheets are molecularly stacked in the Z-axis to encourage vertical direct thermal transfer from the IHS to the cooler. CryoSheet pads are made to be easily applicable for a thermal interface and completely avoid paste dryout because it's not paste. It makes them particularly useful for long service life systems with minimal maintenance. They come in multiple sizes for suitability on the most common laptops and desktop CPUs, and you can learn more at the Thermal Grizzly CryoSheets at the link in the description below. Today's testing will be focused on the improvements for Intel Arc. We're looking at the A770, the A750, the A580. We have A380 results in there as well. It's not really the key focus today, but they're in there if you care about them. We're testing with the latest 5252 drivers that are supposed to further bolster performance in several games, and these were preceded by 5234. Not a huge change between them. In fact, in most instances, there's zero change. It's just that there were some iterative improvements with 5252 for Starfield, so we added those. And they both offer a huge list of DX11 improvements and some DX12 improvements. Intel's biggest challenges have been DirectX 9 and DirectX 11. And they really focused on DirectX 9. DX11 has been the next focus. So that's supporting those older games and anything coming out today that's been in development for long enough to use either. Intel's also changed how it's running DX9, or is working on changing, and how it's running DX11. We'll have news for you soon on that and some of the technical details of it. That should improve as well. But the video today will be a mix of benchmarks and some talking head commentary just for fun to talk about where things are right now, because we think this is a lot more interesting than what NVIDIA and AMD have out for the last month. Pricing is a good starting point, so let's start there. With some quick browsing, here's the update on the relevant part of the market in US pricing. The Intel Arc A770 16GB model, which is what we're testing these days, is typically around $290 to $300. The A750 has its cheapest entry at $205, at least at the time of writing. A Sparkle variant that we tested is at $210, and plenty of others are in the $220 range. The A750 has been the card we've tended to recommend the most out of Intel's current lineup, and that's been because of the value. The A580 is priced at $165 at the lowest, with other options at $180 with Newegg and Amazon listings. The A380 is priced at around $120 these days, with the A310, the only card not tested today since it's too low end for these tests, at around $90 to $110. For competition, the RTX 4060 is NVIDIA's cheapest and most relevant 40 series card, priced at around $300 to $320. The 4060 Ti 8GB is still around $400 and is in a substantially different price class from Intel's options today. The 3050 is around $250 these days for the 8GB model, and will underperform every single one of these cards we've mentioned so far, except the A380, and the 3056 GB doesn't count. There's also the 3060 at $285. For AMD, it's mostly the 7600 at $260, the 7600 XT, the brand new card, at $330, and the RX 6600 from last gen, but still a great value, at $200. The 6600 XT is around $240, also a pretty good value the past year, and the 6650 XT refresh is at $250. So those 6600 series cards are going to be the most relevant from AMD's price to performance standpoint, while the 7600 is its most relevant from the newest standpoint. So there's a surprising amount of cards in this price class, actually, if you really look at it. It's just that most of them are from AMD and from Intel. The AMD part's not surprising. Intel is obviously the new one to arrive to this part of the market, but NVIDIA has only one modern option that's anywhere close to this price class. And again, the 3050 6GB technically is a new card, but it has cut down cores. It is slower for frequency a lot. It doesn't count. So the 4060 is the closest relevant one, other than last gen stuff, where it's kind of the 3060, and we have that in the charts as well. For the charts today, we have cut the high end from them to make space for all of these cards. So the 4090, 4080, 4080 Super, 7900 XTX, those have been removed. The 6950 in a lot of instances removed. If you want those numbers, check our 4080 Super, or actually you get more numbers in the 4070 Ti Super review, and that'll give you the high end. We've also just published the article versions of our Super reviews on gamersnexus.net, and this will join them in a few days, so you can check it out there. As a reminder, that's an ad-free version of all of our reviews, absolutely no third-party banner ads, so it loads stupidly fast as a result. It's single page, no jumping through a ton of pages for review, and if you want fast answers on hardware performance, check out the site. It's all entirely funded by you all, so to support our ad-free written reviews and to support the benchmarking that happens here in the videos, head over to store.gamersnexus.net and please consider grabbing one of our comfortable t-shirts with PC component designs, our silicone soldering and project mats with extreme heat resistance, or our GN 3D emblem glass, the 15th anniversary edition, which has a super cool metal emblem on the glass. You can find all of that on the store. Let's get into the testing. Resident Evil 4 had the Intel A750 at 104 to 105 FPS average, which is about tied with the RX 6600 XT and RX 7600 GPUs. It's a great place for the A750 to start, and at a lower price than the RX 7600, it's also competitive. The A770 pushes up to 116 FPS average, leading the brand new, freshly launched $330 RX 7600 XT by 5.2%. while costing $40 less. As for NVIDIA, its last-gen 3060 Ti is about equal, while the new 4060, about $10 more than an A770, falls behind in this chart. That's remarkable comparative performance for Intel. For the A580, we saw a 91 FPS average that ranked it between the RX 6600, currently still available for $190 to $200, and the RTX 2070 Super. It's not distant either from the goated 1080 Ti. And finally, the A380 is predictably at the bottom of the chart. It's the lowest end card we've tested anytime recently, so we need to add the GT 1030 or GTX 1650 class cards to compare closer. At 1440p, the A750 and A770 remain in completely playable territory despite the increase in graphics strain. The A580 is also playable here, although depending on your preferences, maybe just barely. The A380 predictably can't handle this, and the important comparisons go like this. The A750 runs about 72 FPS average, tied with the brand new, significantly more expensive 7600 XT, which falls in relative position in this test from the increased pixel processing load. That means the 7600 XT is 57% more expensive than the A750 for equivalent performance, so in other words, yikes. The RX 7600, meanwhile, is also functionally tied, but it still costs more. As for NVIDIA, the 4060 allows Intel a lead of almost 5%, but Intel maintains the cost advantage. The A580 also punches above its weight class, landing at 62 FPS average and leading the RX 6600 by 7%. And finally, the A770 leads the 7600 XT by about 9%, with the 4060 Ti leading the A770 more notably at about 14%. At 4K, the A770 doesn't quite make it to playable territory without any upscaling assistance or lower settings. Comparatively, it's now about equal to the 4060 Ti, though, which has shifted down due to weaknesses in places like memory bandwidth. We talked about that with the 4060 Ti review. We're moving on to Rainbow Six Siege. This game was the bane of Intel's existence at launch, posting some of the worst performance we'd seen for this level of hardware ever. It was so bad that Rainbow Six was one of the first titles that Intel specifically targeted for improvements, prompting follow-up testing where we actually did see the parts start to improve for the first time. In today's updated chart, though, and first at 4K, the A750 runs at 79 FPS average and roughly ties both the 4060 and the 7600 in average 1% and 0.1% lows. Given that it's cheaper than both, that's another strong position for Intel, especially with the frame time pacing now being fixed. The A770 sits between the 6700 XT, which outpaces the 7600 XT, and the RTX 4060 Ti. The A770's lead over the 7600 XT is 8%, with a lead of 10% over the 4060, and the 4060 Ti leads the A770 by 12%, similar to last time. Just for perspective, we have two A580 entries on this chart. That's intentional. Other cards haven't changed nearly as much, but Intel has, and that indicates that Intel's improvements largely came from its drivers, not just the game, which itself has updated. The old A580 result had it at 36 FPS average, with completely unplayable and highly inconsistent lows. The frame time pacing was bad. The new drivers have brought that up to an impressive 68 FPS, or a 91% improvement. Shows how much power the drivers have when they're not as mature as NVIDIA's are. The lows have gone from broken to actually consistent, and that pulls it ahead of the 6600. At 1440p, the Intel Arc cards fall in the ranks. Comparatively, they're doing a lot better at 4K against the competition. The A750 here, though, outperforms the RX 6600 XT by 5.3%, but the 7600 leads the A750 by 13%, up at 177 FPS average. The A770 also doesn't scale as strongly here, roughly tying the 4060 and falling behind the 7600. That odd behavior continues at 1080p, where Intel struggles to keep rank with its normal competition. The RX 7600 now leads the A750 by around 25%, which is a massive change. The A770 is also behind the RTX 4060 and the RX 7600. At least they're playable, but this does illustrate ARC's weakness as being its general unpredictability at times. Dying Light 2 at 1440p, the $290 ARC A770 rivals the $400 4060 Ti, the latter of which has an advantage of only 7% despite a price increase of 38%. Against the 7600 XT, the A770 manages to lead not only in better pricing, but in outright performance, with a 10% advantage. The A750 is roughly tied with the 7600 XT, the 4060, and the 7600, meaning the primary differentiating factor between these in this game is price. And as for the A580, it's competitive with the 6600 XT here, which is a good spot for it to be. At 1080p, the 4060 climbs and equals the A770 GPU. The 7600 isn't far behind. The A750 approaches the 7600 levels of performance, but has clearly fallen somewhat from its higher resolution rankings. Final Fantasy at 4K, the A770 runs at about 56 FPS average, which has it 5% ahead of the RTX 4060. The 4060 leads the A750 by 9%. AMD's 7600 XT is about tied with the A750, doing it no favors in a price battle. Finally, the A580 is now about equal to the 6600 XT. At 1440p, the A770 is tied with the 4060 in all metrics, leading the 7600 XT and the 7600. The A750 is perceptibly equal to the 7600 from a user experience standpoint, although with technically better 1% lows. And the A580 is flanked by the 6600 and the 3060. Intel is competing with its similarly classed parts here. That's all it needs to do. At 1080p, a wider gap forms again, so this seems to be a trend between some games with Intel. The 4060 at 190 FPS average now leads the A770 by 3.7%. The A770 is about tied with the 7600 for average FPS now. Its only advantage in this chart is price this time. In an absolute sense, the A580 and the A380 are both playable here in the very least. Unfortunately for Intel, it's sometimes just completely broken. GTA 5 appears to be one of those times. In this test, none of the Intel cards could get out of the 30 FPS range when running with these settings. You can still get the frame rate higher, but you have to drop the settings and the resolution. And the point here is that they are deviating from what we expected from all the other results. So based on the previous charts, the A770 should be at least up around 50 FPS, if not closer to 60. But it's just not doing it here. Starfield is another one that's specifically broken, in a sense, on Arc, and they know this. In fact, their latest driver was supposed to fix this, but we're not seeing the fix. We tried these drivers, and the ones that predate them one revision as well, and both produced the same result. Unfortunately for Arc, its performance mirrors that of GTA 5's in the prior test, and it's just clearly broken. It runs, but the RTX 4060 has a frame rate multiples faster, with the 7600 also boosted way beyond what we've seen in other games. It's instances like these that hurt Arc's wide-reaching viability, and these are the only reasons we hesitate when answering whether or not someone should buy Arc. Our ray tracing tests are next, and these are actually really interesting for Arc. Some of these games are shared with the earlier ones for rasterized tests, but for RT we use different settings, obviously, and they're not directly comparable. As an interesting note as well, RT hardware is available even on the A310. It won't run well for most applications, but the hardware's there. That could be useful somewhere, but we'll start with Cyberpunk and 1080p medium RT settings without upscaling. If you want to use upscaling to boost the performance, go for it, but for purposes of comparing two devices by relative performance, this is what we want. In this test, the A770 ran at 38 FPS average and held strong lows that were proportional to the average. You would want upscaling or reduced settings to get a more stable experience here, but again, our goals are to compare in the relative sense. The RTX 4060 outperforms the A770 by 3.4%, putting Intel dangerously close to NVIDIA when considering NVIDIA's general advantage in RT workloads. And in fact, the A770 has stronger 0.1% low performance that we'll see in a Frametime plot in a moment. The 4060 has more sporadic performance and Frametime pacing with these settings than we typically see. The A750 allowed the 4060 an 18% advantage, so a big gap from the 770, but it still managed a significant lead over the RX 7600. This Frametime plot shows the raw frame-to-frame interval in milliseconds, or time required to render a frame as presented in its base metric of time. We're currently showing two passes of the RTX 4060. Here you can see that one of the passes had several spikes higher than 50 milliseconds. The other pass has one bad spike to about 110 milliseconds, which is 1/10 of a second that you'd be staring at the same frame, so that's a pretty big spike. The A770 is much more consistent and lacks any of these massive spikes. That's how the 0.1% lows are supposed to be used in our FPS charts. They're an indicator as a bar that point us towards a problem we can represent as a line. And here, the problem is the 4060's ability to consistently deliver well-timed frames. 1080p Ultra is where we see NVIDIA really pull ahead of AMD with unbelievably large gaps that illustrate how higher RT loads will disproportionately benefit NVIDIA performance. Despite being unplayable, the raw performance shows that Intel manages to keep up better than AMD does. Price for price, Arc is impressive. A 28 FPS average result for the A770, still with relatively flat frame times, has it close to an RX 7700 XT. That's a $290 Intel card competing with a $420 to $450 AMD card. The lead over the RX 7600 XT model for the A770 is 46% here, with the A750 leading the RX 7600 base model by 58%. The A750 also manages to maintain more proportional frame times than the RX 7600, which sees them diverge from the average more noticeably. As for why Intel does so well in Cyberpunk specifically, Intel's Tom Peterson provided some engineering insight when we asked why. And he said this, quote, "In Cyberpunk, we see good results from the BVH cache. Since a large fraction of the time in that app with RT-heavy workloads, we're walking BVHs. It also is likely that the thread sorting unit is helping. The thread sorting unit is a physical piece of hardware on the GPU, while BVH cache is an area where Intel has spent significant special optimization effort. We'll talk more about these in future topics and video." In Resident Evil 4 at 1080p with RT and using quality FSR, the A770 landed at about 84 FPS average and equated the RX 7600. although it maintained better frame time consistency in the 0.1% lows. The RTX 4060 leads the A770 by 14.6% here, with the A750 tying the 2070. This game is a lighter RT workload, so AMD is able to recover its position in this particular title. We see similar behavior in games like Tomb Raider with RT, where only one RT feature is actually used. We're including 1440p here because it reinforces an earlier point. The A770 is able to gain ground on the RTX 4060 in this test, which has its lead reduced from 15% in the 1080p chart to just 1%. So a big jump, and the resolution bump is hard for the 4060 and 4060 Ti cards to handle at this scale. Dying Light 2 is significantly heavier as an RT workload than Resident Evil 4 and tends to have wider gaps between AMD and NVIDIA. At 1080p, the A770 ran at 66 FPS average and actually managed to technically outmatch the 4060. The A750 follows, with the 7600 and its 46 FPS average just an afterthought. The A750's lead over the 7600 is 30% here. At 1440p, the A770 is slightly ahead of the RTX 4060 again, with the A750 just behind, and these RX 7600 series cards are dragging behind here as well. As usual, we have plenty more data and games we've tested. You can find most of those in our 7600 XT review, our 4070 Ti Super review. They have more games packed into them, and most of these ARC results, well, the cards are present, just they've gotten updated a little more since then. But you can find even more there if you really want it. The point is, though, that the trend in all of the games matches the trend of what we showed today. It kind of encapsulates everything, where sometimes it works phenomenally well, and we're really impressed by how much ground they've gained, and other times it's still just functionally utterly broken, which is unfortunate. So outside of gaming, Intel still has some challenges we didn't talk about, and those can be with power consumption. So for example, the ARC cards have relatively high idle power consumption, and that's something we talked about in our driver update video where we did the revisit 1 year later, about a month or I guess 2-3 months ago now. Additionally, under load, frame for frame, Intel is less efficient than NVIDIA. It's maybe not a surprise. AMD's in the same boat, but if it's something you really care about, then Intel is weaker there. And we think there has to be a priorities list for GPU manufacturers when they're in a position like Intel is, where it's not only the underdog, but it's brand new to this market, and it's fighting another underdog, because if you can't run games, or you struggle with it, like GTA, like Starfield, like they did with Counter-Strike at the beginning, that's fixed now, then none of it matters. Doesn't matter how power efficient it is. It's infinitely power efficient if there's 0 FPS. Or actually, maybe infinitely power inefficient. It depends how you want to divide by 0 there. But the point is, we've separately deep dived into Intel's ARC drivers in the software suite as recently as, again, a couple months ago. And when we did that revisit, we found that they had massively improved. And we'll link that below if you want to learn more about it, or you can read it on the website. As for conclusions, they're pretty simple. When Intel ARC works, it works exceptionally well for the price that it is. This is a stark change from the initial launch when we bashed it for having several games that were completely broken, stuttered in unplayable ways, had a driver package that would crash when you clicked on buttons as if no one had ever used the software at Intel, so that so far has been fixed. They had all kinds of blurring and artifacting mess that happened as a result of their special features, and much of that has been resolved. It seems ARC is still somewhat binary, but it's a lot better. Despite its strong performance, it either works, in which case it's a scary competitor for AMD more than it is for NVIDIA, or it's functionally broken and stuck at frame rates that are so low as to be irrelevant. In this round of tests, though, the amount of times it was broken is far lower than we've seen for our numerous revisits over the past year. We're at 2 titles that performed really poorly in this round of tests, and that's out of 14 games that we tested in total, when including the unpublished tests. So 2 of 14, it's not a good percentage, but both are on older engines, and maybe there's a link there. We do think that Intel remains in a class of buyers where it should probably be someone with enthusiast-level knowledge. However, it's slowly exiting that class and becoming something that can be recommended to a slightly more mainstream level. So where we draw a line is somewhere like if you have a family member who wants to build a PC and they have either no patience or time for PCBS, or it is someone who has absolutely no troubleshooting capabilities, or a mix of the two, probably you don't tell them to buy an A750. If you don't want to deal with the problems when they arise. But we do think that this is now in some type of category between hardcore enthusiast and mainstream. So whatever you might call that slimmer group of users, maybe the word is just patient. And the good news is that the patience isn't getting tested nearly as much as it was 18 months ago. As for RT, Intel is competitive with AMD and it's outclassing it in some scenarios. NVIDIA still holds significant advantages in overwhelmingly RT-heavy titles like Cyberpunk, but once again, Intel is competing in sometimes stronger ways than AMD is. And that's where we think a lot of this story is going. For value, the A750 has held strong recommendations when it occasionally drops to 180 bucks. That was crazy when it did that. But even at 210, we think it makes sense to buy now. It's starting to clear some of those hurdles. For a lot of our audience, if you're spending $200, it really makes sense to seriously consider Arc now. The A770 is also posting better value now that its price has fallen below $300. And certainly it puts some pressure on the 4060 and 7600 XT. We still want to be extremely clear though, which is that Intel Arc still has problems, and those problems, when they happen, are the kind that are frustrating because there's really not much you can do about it. And it's not just like the performance isn't quite as good as a competitor. It's like the performance is half or worse of a competitor. A lot of the frame time pacing problems have been fixed, so at least it's not stuttering as hard in those situations, but we're talking half the frame rate it probably should be. It's not a good feeling. And the big caveat is that it doesn't happen a whole lot, but the reason I feel the need to keep saying it is because I need the audience, need you all to be aware of it, where we do think it's a good value, but the times it doesn't work, it's gonna suck. It's just that those times aren't as much as they used to be. Overall though, we are hugely impressed with the performance improvements that Intel has posted. If you go look at the driver patch notes, the length of some of those lists shows that there is an active effort to continue improving. Hopefully the recent rounds of layoffs at Intel and other tech companies, but Intel here, haven't affected the driver development team in a way that's gonna really slow things, because that's where they need their focus. The drivers, as we showed, improved a lot for usability, for the interface, but now it's on continuing to push the performance, and we think they're doing well there. So anyway, we have an active project right now. We're doing some PC build guides again, first time in a while. So some of those use Intel Arc. We've got AMD and NVIDIA follow-ups for people who want to just have that like guaranteed, I don't want to deal with anything weird at all. We're going to be working on build guides for each of those. So really excited about it. Check back for that. Subscribe for it. Go to store.gamersnexus.net if you want to support our testing efforts directly and buy something like one of our GN15 glasses with the metal emblem on it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.